Okay, let's talk about slavery. This person left a comment on my video about how the Irish potato famine was not, in fact, a famine, and they seem to be implying that I am not calling the Irish who lived under British colonial rule slaves because they were white. I'm not calling them slaves because they were not, in fact, slaves, and let me tell you why. The Irish who lived under British colonial rule were very badly treated. They were absolutely exploited. They were discriminated against. They were singled out based on their religion and ethnicity, but they were not slaves. When we're talking about slavery, the most common form of slavery in the world from ancient to modern is chattel slavery. And chattel slavery is when human beings are treated legally and socially as property. They do not have the right to choose where they live, to choose what kind of work they do. They're not allowed to choose what kind of clothes they wear, what they eat. They're not allowed to earn money for themselves. They're not allowed to keep their children with them. They are subject to any kind of abuse that the owner of that slave wants to subject them to, and they're forced to do anything that that owner says, and they can be sold at any time. Legally, they're not people, they're property, legally. So, most of the time when we're talking about slavery, that's what we're talking about. Chattel slavery, where people are treated as property. Now, there are other types of slavery in the world that still exist today. In theory, chattel slavery has been outlawed in every country on earth as of about 2007, so very recently, but other forms of slavery that are pretty common are debt slavery, where you take out a loan, you can't pay it back, and so you have to work for that person who gave you the loan until it's paid off. And in some countries, this can last for generations, where your children also have to work this debt off. Sometimes girls are sold to pay off their father's debt, things like that. So, forced marriage is a form of slavery. Conscription, where someone would be kidnapped and taken onto a ship and forced to work on the ship, that's still happening. Penal labor, where people are forced to work as part of their prison sentence. This is real common in the United States. I would consider it a form of slavery. Now, technically, those folks are paid a tiny bit of money, and so I guess we're getting around it, but it doesn't look good, right? Sex trafficking is a form of slavery. And any kind of work that you're forced to do under threat of violence, that would be considered a form of slavery. But again, not chattel slavery, because although you are being forced to work, you're not being paid, and your freedom and your free will is being taken away, you are not treated as property by the law. And I think that's a really, really essential and important distinction that we need to understand. The people who lived in the United States under chattel slavery did not have any legal rights as people. The native Irish people who lived under British colonial rule were certainly exploited, were certainly treated very poorly, and they did not have the same level of rights as the landlords who owned all of the land in Ireland, or as much as a British person would have. But they did have some rights. They were legally people. And it sounds pretty basic, but like that's kind of a big deal when you compare it to chattel slavery, when they were not legally considered to be people. They were allowed to marry whoever they wanted and to get married, period, which slaves were not allowed to do. They were allowed to choose where they lived. They were allowed to choose where they worked. They were allowed to choose their profession. They were allowed to keep their children with them. So the system that was set up by the British colonial rulers was that this land in Ireland was confiscated, gifted to various British lords as their own personal fiefdoms, and they would not, most of them, even set foot on Ireland to see it. Like maybe they'd come like twice in their lives to see this land that they had in Ireland. So they were very far removed from the actual process of collecting rents from the tenants, and they would have these middlemen go over, let's call them property managers, shall we? These property managers would go over and would make money by extracting as much rent as possible from farmers. So say the landlord said, oh, charge them £5 rent or whatever it was. The property manager would go over and say, okay, your rent's £10. And he would keep the £5. So they did things like extracting rents that were impossible to pay. They could kick farmers off the land at will. There were no tenants' rights for the people who lived in this time period. They would do things like they would subdivide the plots of land into smaller and smaller tenant plots, so that the plots were so small the tenants couldn't possibly grow a crop big enough to pay this rent. So there were a lot of exploitative practices, and there was no motivation at all in the British government to fix any of this. And from what I read, in the years leading up to the famine, that was not a famine, they had any number of worried essays and committees and findings in Parliament about how things were desperate in Ireland, but they didn't do anything to fix the problem. So were the people who lived under British colonial rule in Ireland horribly, horribly exploited? Yes. Were there massive injustices perpetrated against them? Absolutely. Was the potato famine a genocide? I think without a doubt. But the status of people who lived under chattel slavery was worse. It was demonstrably worse. Legally, morally, it was a lot worse.